Howdy everyone, and here we go with another Nikon lens review, and today I have an old but popular one, the AF-S VR Nikon 70-300mm f4.5 to 5.6 G IF-ED. This class of telephoto zoom lens for full-frame cameras have been popular for years, and this one first came out in 2006. It's since been superseded by the newer AF-P version of the lens, which is meant to have a number of improvements, but it's more expensive and only works with Nikon's very newest cameras, whereas this older AF-S version works with all of Nikon's digital SLR cameras, as far as I'm aware. I've put a link in the description below to Nikon's official compatibility chart in all its complicated glory, if you want to get your head around that. It'll also mount onto Nikon's new Z mount mirrorless cameras if you own the rather expensive FTZ adapter. This AF-S version is not really made anymore, but you can easily find it for less than £300 or $300 or so if you look around a bit. Its zoom range is telephoto all the way, making this a nice lens to take with you for landscape photography, spotting wildlife or shooting a sports game on the cheap. If you're shooting on a crop sensor or DX camera, then it'll be the full-frame equivalent of 105 to 450mm, bringing you even closer to your subject. Its maximum aperture of only f4.5 to 5.6 means that it doesn't let in a lot of light for getting fast shutter speeds, although if you zoom all the way in, you can at least get some nicely out of focus backgrounds. The lens does have an older version of Nikon's vibration reduction system to help you get sharper pictures at slower shutter speeds and smoother video footage. Here's some footage with it turned off and now turned on. As you can see, it makes quite a difference, although the image isn't quite as rock steady as newer image stabilization systems can get. The lens itself is mostly made of plastic and is the normal kind of size and weight for a telephoto zoom in its class. It's based on a metal lens mount with a rubber weather sealing gasket around the edge. Next comes the focus ring. It can be turned at any time and it's reasonably precise, although it doesn't turn very smoothly. When you change focus on this lens, we see just a little focus breathing. The lens zooms in just a tiny bit as you focus more closely. The autofocus motor works fairly quickly, making a quiet whooshing sound, but some slightly noisy clicking too as it focus hunts, so when shooting video, that will pick up on your microphone. Next comes a very large rubberized zoom ring. It's pretty sticky to turn and doesn't work very evenly, to be honest. The lens comes with quite a deep hood and its filter size is 67mm in diameter. Overall, pretty average build quality here for an older lens of this type, a little bit plasticky, but quite usable nonetheless. Let's look at image quality now. I'm going to test it way beyond the expectations it was originally designed for by adapting it onto my Nikon Z7 with its full-frame 45-megapixel sensor, a serious challenge for any camera lens. We'll start at 70mm. At the maximum aperture of f4.5, we see fantastic sharpness in the middle and decent enough contrast. The corners of the image are not too terrible here. Stop down to f5.6 or f8 to see some little improvements. Stop down to f11 though, and it starts to get a little softer again from the effects of diffraction, so f8 is your sweet spot here. Let's zoom in halfway to 180mm. At the new maximum aperture of f5, the middle of the image is only averagely sharp now, with somewhat weaker contrast. The image corners are just okay. They remain this sharp at f8, but the middle of the image looks a little punchier. f11 is about the same in the middle, but the corners show a small improvement now. And let's zoom in all the way now to 300mm. In the middle of the image, we see the lens really struggling to cope with this high-resolution sensor, and contrast is particularly poor. The corners look pretty soft now too, with quite some colour fringing visible. Stop down to f8 for a small improvement in those corners, although back in the middle, contrast levels are vastly better. Image quality across the frame is the same at f11 though, no improvements anywhere, and that's as sharp as this lens gets at 300mm. You can actually stop the lens all the way down to f40 here, although as you can see, diffraction takes a huge toll on image quality when you do. Overall, this lens can be fairly sharp at its widest angles, particularly with the aperture stopped down a bit. Performance when zoomed all the way in, though, is quite poor, particularly on a high-resolution sensor. Well, this lens will also work on Nikon's aps-c cameras, so let's test it out on a Nikon D5600 with its 24 megapixel aps-c sensor. At 70mm and f4.5, sharpness in the middle of the image is okay. Again, the corners are a little softer but not terribly bad. Stop down to f5.6 for a nice improvement there, and lots of sharpness back in the middle. f8 looks even a tiny bit better there, and the corners look great now. Stop down to f11 though, and the image will begin to soften a little from the effect of diffraction. Let's zoom in to 180mm. At f5, the lens is looking pretty sharp in the middle of the image now. The corners, however, are rather soft. Stop down to f8 for a little more contrast there, and f11 looks a little sharper now too. And finally, let's zoom all the way into 300mm. At f5.6 there is some detail there to be seen, although contrast is pretty poor. The corners are outright soft with some colour fringing. Stop down to f8 and that colour fringing recedes a little bit, and contrast back in the middle is improved. Stop down to f11 for, well, no further improvement really, either in the middle or in the corners. Overall, this lens's performance is a little bit dull on an aps-c camera, but it can admittedly get you a reasonable amount of detail, especially if you stop down the aperture a bit. Okay, well, let's move on from all that and take a look at distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera. Here are some results with automatic corrections turned off. At 70mm and f4.5, we see some very mild barrel distortion, and the image corners are slightly dark. You have to stop down to f8 to see even brightness across the image frame. All you have to do is zoom in to 100mm, and that distortion suddenly flips to pincushion, and the corners look more noticeably dark at the widest apertures. Zoom all the way into 300mm, and the pincushion distortion calms down just a little bit, but it is still noticeable. At least vignetting isn't too strong though. Now let's take a look at close-up image quality. The lens can only focus down to 1.5 meters over 4 foot, not very close at all really. Even worse is that dreadful close-up image quality, coating even the slightest of contrasting edges in radioactive purple. Stop down to f8 or f11 to see it reduced, but generally you will want to keep your subject as far away from this lens as possible. Now let's see how it performs against bright lights. At wider angles, just averagely well, with some notable flaring. Zoom in for a lot more glaring and a loss of contrast. And finally, bokeh. As I've mentioned, if you zoom all the way into your subject, you can get some nice background separation. Those out of focus backgrounds look reasonably smooth, but nothing really special. Overall, well, this performance is generally a bit unsatisfactory, as my old Latin teacher used to say about my homework assignments. It's a 14-year-old lens now, which clearly wasn't over-designed at the time, and so on modern cameras it simply cannot cope so well. Its build quality is so-so, and its image quality is particularly weak at 300mm, which is where you're likely to want to use it the most. So really, honestly, I'd give this one a miss.